what can you give us a sense of the history of a brief, perhaps, history of how race, ethnicity, and indigeneity became field of research, both in academia generally, but also if you can tell us a little bit about the history of how the Race, Ethnic, and Indigenous Studies program became a program of study here at Marquette.
Okay, I mean, I can start with the longer kind of global history of, or REIS, Race, Ethnic, and Indigenous Studies in the US context, grew out of the civil rights movement. So the 1960s, Martin Luther King, civil unrest, protests, and student and worker movements, right? So it was really a project that grew out of activism. And that same type of activism that we saw in the 1960s, right? We've seen other moments of that across history, most recently with the Black Lives Matter movement, and also with feminist movements that have really sprouted up all over the world, but particularly in Latin America. And so really student demand is what led to race, ethnic, and indigenous studies programs in the 1960s. And, you know, then we have moments like when Kimberly Crenshaw in the 1980s really planted the idea of intersectionality, which, you know, looked at things like, all right, if we were going to talk about the experience of Black women, right, they're kind of, those experiences are lost within the feminist movement, but they're also lost, right, within maybe the civil rights movement, because Black women get kind of subsumed under Black men. So what do we do with those voices? And I think as history has shown, right, more and more voices are being included in the constitution of knowledge and the telling of history. And so kind of globally, I think critical race, ethnic, and indigenous studies is like just getting underway in a lot of senses. And I think maybe Stephanie can talk about the Marquette history.
Yeah, I mean, dovetailing with the story of activism, and I would say this is probably true of a lot of higher education. Change doesn't happen unless students demand it. And so really the history of the study of race, ethnic and indigenous studies at Marquette commences with student activism that makes the possibilities of something like Africana studies possible in the 90s. And we slowly start aggregating small little nodes or programs across the university over, I would say, a long period of time. And then if we kind of accelerate the clock a little to the pandemic, the wake of the murder of George Floyd, all forming kind of a hotbed of activism in Milwaukee, but also in particular putting pressures on the university to respond to a racial culture that is highly problematic. And so I wouldn't say it's any one thing, but probably a combination of all of those things that finally made the administration sway in the direction of giving us resources in order to be able to arm this center a year ago. So here we are. But that's not to say that this hasn't been part of a longer threaded history of fights that students have been at the forefront of pressures that faculty members have been at the forefront of, even if they're not necessarily legible or there's no archive of them, as that's also not an accidental feature, right? For it to look like we just kind of sprouted up out of nowhere, even though we really didn't. And so, but here we are. So in short, brief history of how we kind of came about. And so, yeah, we took over last year, or we started and took over, I guess, and are in a 3-year term. So this is the beginning of our the end of our first year. There we go. It feels like we've been doing this much longer.